The morning sunlight crept through the heavy drapes of Charles and Shirley's bedroom, falling across his face as he stared at the ceiling, sleepless for the third night in a row. He had been turning things over in his mind, again and again, like waves pounding against rocks that refused to give way. His son's birthday was just 2 days away, and Shirley had made it painfully clear. There would be no celebration this year. Her voice had been cold when she said it, the same chilling tone she had started using more and more lately. "It's just a distraction," she had snapped, not even looking up from her phone. "We have other priorities, Charles." But what? Priorities could be more important than their son Daniel turning 6? The boy had been counting down for weeks, his innocent eyes lighting up every morning as he checked the little calendar Charles had pinned to the wall for him. Charles couldn't bear the thought of seeing that light dim, of explaining to Daniel why his special day would pass like any other ordinary gray afternoon. He pushed himself out of bed, his jaw tight with frustration. Shirley lay beside him, scrolling mindlessly through her screen, barely acknowledging his movement. There had been a time when they had shared dreams, whispered plans for their future, promised each other they would raise their children in a house full of love and laughter. Now it felt like they were two strangers living parallel lives under the same roof. Charles dressed in silence and headed downstairs, his steps heavy, but his resolve firming with every stride. Alvin, his oldest friend and now trusted right-hand man, was waiting in the kitchen, sipping coffee and glancing over a stack of logistics papers. "You look like hell," Alvin remarked, though his tone carried more concern than mockery. Charles rubbed his temples. "I've made up my mind," he said without hesitation. "If Shirley won't give Daniel the birthday he deserves, I will." Alvin raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What's the plan?" Charles's gaze drifted toward the window, where the morning sun kissed the horizon. He imagined Daniel's smile, the way his small hands clapped with excitement at even the simplest joys. His son deserved more than quiet disappointments and cold refusals. "I want to throw him a party," Charles said slowly, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him like armor. "Not just any party. I want it to be something unforgettable. Private island, balloons, fireworks, the whole thing. Everything he's ever dreamed of." Alvin let out a low whistle, setting his coffee mug down. "That's ambitious, but if anyone can pull it off, it's you." A flicker of determination flared in Charles's chest. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this clear-headed. All the years of compromises, of bending to Shirley's increasingly distant demands, were coming to an end. At least, for this moment, he was doing something that felt right. Later that day, Charles found Daniel in the backyard, playing quietly with a toy boat in the small fountain. His golden-brown curls were tousled by the breeze, and his cheeks were flushed with excitement as he made soft whooshing sounds, sailing his boat across the water's surface. "Hey, champ," Charles called, kneeling beside him. Daniel looked up, his eyes bright with hope. "Daddy, is my birthday still happening?" Charles felt his heart tighten, but he forced a smile. "Not just happening, Daniel. It's going to be the best birthday you've ever had." The boy's grin was worth every sleepless night, every argument with Shirley, every ounce of effort this would take. As Charles rose, he caught sight of Shirley watching from the patio, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her expression was a cold mask of disapproval, but Charles no longer cared. He had made his choice, and this time, he wasn't backing down. The morning of the next day arrived with a sharp chill in the air, but Charles barely felt it. His mind was racing with plans, calculations, and quiet determination. Alvin had already lined up a few locations, and by noon they had settled on a private island just an hour's flight away, secluded, breathtaking, and untouched by the tension that filled Charles's home. In the kitchen, Alvin spread out blueprints and schedules across the marble counter while Charles stood over him, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in focus. "We'll need decorations, games, a cake, and not just any cake," Charles said firmly. "I want something magical, something that'll make Daniel's eyes light up the second he sees it." Alvin smirked, tapping his pen against the paper. "What? About fireworks?" Definitely fireworks, Charles replied without hesitation. He's never seen them up close. They worked through the list until the table was covered in plans and supplier contacts. Olivia, the event planner Alvin had recommended, joined them later in the afternoon. She was sharp, quick to grasp the vision Charles painted, and unafraid to push limits. "I can make this happen," Olivia assured him, flipping through her tablet with practiced ease. "But it's going to take everything we've got. Chartering, a boat for the supplies, flying in the crew, setting up safety permits, not to mention getting guests to the island." "Guests?" Charles repeated, a shadow crossing his face. He hadn't thought of that part. He couldn't invite Shirley's cold circle of socialites, not after the way they had slowly poisoned their marriage with shallow gossip and plastic smiles. "No family," he decided sharply. "Just Daniel's friends from school. No suits, no snobs. I want laughter, not fake smiles." Olivia nodded, scribbling notes with a flick of her stylus. "Understood. Kids' paradise. No pretenders." A flicker of relief eased the tension in Charles's shoulders. For the first time in weeks, maybe even months, he felt alive. Like he was fighting for something that mattered rather than surviving in the shadow of a loveless marriage. As evening fell, Charles stepped outside to the garden. He needed air, space to think. But as he rounded the corner, he found Shirley already there, standing stiffly by the hedge with a glass of wine in her hand. She barely acknowledged his presence, staring into the distance with that familiar icy detachment. "Planning something. Extravagant, I hear," Shirley said without turning to him, her tone laced with bitterness. Charles felt a surge of heat rise in his chest. He refused to argue, not tonight. Not when there was so much at stake. "Yes," he answered simply, keeping his voice even. "For our son. Because he deserves a day that's about him. Not about our problems. Not about your priorities." Her lips twisted into a cold, bitter smile. "You think you can buy his happiness, Charles?" "No," he shot back quietly. "But I can give him a memory that isn't filled with disappointment." For a heartbeat, her mask slipped. A flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe resentment, passed through her eyes before she turned away. She walked back toward the house without another word, leaving Charles alone under the darkening sky. That night, as he sat in his study finalizing the last details with Olivia and Alvin over video calls, Daniel wandered in wearing his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Daddy," he mumbled, "do you think Mama will come to my party?" Charles's heart clenched. He paused, swallowing the tightness in his throat before he answered. "I don't know, champ," he said honestly, pulling Daniel onto his lap. "But no matter. What? I'll be there. And it's going to be the best day of your life." Daniel's head rested against his chest, his small voice barely a whisper. "I just want us to be happy. Like before." Charles tightened his arms around him, feeling the weight of his son's innocent wish press into his heart like a knife. He didn't reply this time. There were no words big enough to cover the cracks in their family. All he could do was make a silent promise. Come what may, he would give Daniel this day. One perfect, unforgettable day. The next morning broke with a strange quiet in the house, the kind that settles in just before a storm. Charles had been up since dawn, pacing the living room as he waited for updates from Alvin and Olivia. His phone buzzed constantly, texts, calls, confirmations. Supplies were being loaded onto the boat, decorations were en route, and the island crew was already setting up a wonderland of color and joy. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt a hollow knot tightening in his chest. From the top of the staircase, he heard soft footsteps. Daniel peeked over the banister, eyes still heavy with sleep but sparkling with curiosity. "Is it today, Daddy?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with the fragile hope of a child who had been let down too many times before. Charles forced a warm smile. "It is, buddy. Get ready for an adventure." Daniel's grin could have lit the whole house. He scampered off to get dressed, shouting happily about his favorite shirt. the one with tiny sailboats printed across it. For a moment, just that moment, Charles felt something close to peace. But peace never lasted long in this house. He turned toward the dining room and found Shirley seated at the table, idly stirring her untouched coffee. She wore her sharp, tailored, robe-like armor, her expression unreadable as she scrolled through her phone. Without looking up, she spoke in a voice that cut straight through him. "So you're really going through with this circus?" Charles kept his tone calm, though inside his frustration churned. "For Daniel." "Yes." Shirley set her phone down with a soft clink. Her eyes, cool and calculating, finally met his. "You're spoiling him, Charles, teaching him that extravagant gestures make up for reality. Life doesn't work like that." "No," Charles replied, his voice steady but tight. "You've been teaching him that reality is cold and joyless. I refuse to let him believe that." Her gaze hardened, but she said nothing. Instead, she rose from her chair, smoothing the fabric of her robe, and walked past him as if he were invisible. The scent of her perfume lingered, sharp and suffocating. By noon, they were on the private jet, Daniel bouncing in his seat with excitement. Alvin sat across from them, reviewing notes on his tablet, while Olivia gave last-minute instructions over the phone. Charles watched Daniel press his nose against the window, pointing out clouds like they were treasures only he could see. Charles's heart ached with both pride and sadness. He wished, more than anything, that Shirley could see their son this way, full of wonder, not weighed down by expectations and indifference. But Shirley had chosen not to join them. She had claimed she had important matters to attend to, though Charles suspected she simply couldn't be bothered. The island came into view like a dream rising from the ocean. Lush palm trees swayed in the breeze, and colorful tents had already been set up along the beach. From the air, it looked like paradise carved out of a forgotten corner of the world. As they landed, Daniel practically leapt from his seat, his excitement contagious. "Daddy, it's amazing!" he shouted, running ahead as soon as they touched down. Charles followed, his chest swelling with quiet satisfaction. The crew had gone beyond expectations. Bright streamers danced in the wind, a massive birthday banner stretched across the palm trees, and tables overflowed with treats and games. A towering cake stood proudly under a canopy, decorated with tiny sailboats and bright blue waves. Olivia approached with a radiant smile. "We're ready, Charles," she said. "It's all yours." Charles looked out over the scene, watching as Daniel raced across the sand, his laughter ringing out like music. For the first time in what felt like years, Charles felt something pure and good rise in his chest. He had done this. He had given his son a moment of real happiness. As the first guests arrived, a small group of Daniel's classmates and their parents, carefully selected to avoid Shirley's poisonous circle, Charles felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The children squealed with joy as they explored the beach, chased each other around, and marveled at the treasure hunt Olivia had prepared. For a while, Charles allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this day could stay perfect. But perfection is a fragile thing. And as he glanced at his phone and saw a new message from Shirley, his stomach twisted. "You're embarrassing yourself. And me. Don't expect me to clean up your mess." Charles locked the screen without replying. Today wasn't about her. It never was. Today belonged to Daniel. The sun hung lazily over the island, casting golden light over the celebration as if it too had decided to join in the joy, if only for a little while. Daniel's laughter carried across the breeze, filling every corner of the beach with an energy that Charles wished he could bottle forever. Watching his son run wild and free across the sand, Charles felt something loosen in his chest, a tight knot that had been building for months, maybe even years. He stood near the refreshment table, a glass of iced tea in hand, as Alvin approached, with a satisfied grin. "You did good, Charles," Alvin said, slapping him on the shoulder. "Look at him. He'll remember this for the rest of his life." Charles managed a small, genuine smile. "That's the point." But even as he said it, his gaze drifted toward the horizon. Despite the beauty of the day, there was an unease scratching at the back of his mind, like the whisper of a storm that hadn't yet arrived. His phone buzzed again, almost mocking him. He hesitated before picking it up, already knowing who it would be. Another message from Shirley, sharp and cutting. "You really think this changes anything? You're wasting money on illusions." He slipped the phone into his pocket, swallowing the bitterness that rose in his throat. He wouldn't let her ruin this. Not today. Not ever again. Turning back to the party, he caught sight of Olivia directing the staff with effortless grace. She moved like she belonged in this paradise, her quick thinking keeping everything running smoothly. Charles found himself quietly admiring her dedication. She had poured herself into this event with a fire that reminded him of someone he used to know, himself, before the weight of his hollow marriage dragged him down. As if sensing his gaze, Olivia approached, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "We're about to start the treasure hunt," she said, her eyes lighting up. "Daniel's been asking about it nonstop." "Lead the way," Charles replied, thankful for the distraction. The children gathered around Olivia, their faces alight with anticipation as she explained the rules. Hidden across the island were small wooden chests, each containing prizes and clues leading to the next. At the end, Daniel himself would discover the grand prize, a miniature replica of the sailboat he always dreamed of. Daniel's eyes sparkled with excitement. "I'm going to find them all, Daddy." "I believe you will, son," Charles said, ruffling his hair. The hunt began, with Daniel charging ahead, his friends trailing after him, their cheers and laughter echoing over the waves. For a few beautiful hours, Charles allowed himself to breathe freely, soaking in the purity of the moment. But just as they were approaching the final chest, a sharp voice broke through the joyous noise like glass shattering on stone. What a ridiculous display! Charles froze. Slowly, he turned to see Shirley standing at the edge of the clearing, her heels sinking slightly into the sand, arms crossed over her chest. She had come after all, but not to celebrate. Her expression was cold as marble, her eyes scanning the scene with thinly veiled contempt. The children paused, their smiles fading as they sensed the tension. Even Daniel hesitated, looking between his parents with uncertain eyes. Charles stepped forward, shielding his son from her bitterness with the only shield he had left, his quiet, unwavering resolve. "Shirley," he said evenly, "this is Daniel's day. If you've come to poison it, I suggest you leave." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Poison? No, Charles. I've come to witness the lengths you'll go to in order to pretend we're not falling apart." Her words struck deeper than he expected, but he held his ground. "Pretending!" He gestured toward Daniel, who stood clutching the small wooden chest to his chest, confusion clouding his innocent face. "That boy isn't pretending. He's living. Shirley, something you've forgotten how to do." For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, something dangerously close to regret. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Without another word, she turned her back on them and began walking toward the waiting yacht, her departure as sharp and final as her arrival. Charles felt Daniel's small hand slip into his. He looked down to see his son's wide, searching eyes staring up at him. "Is Mama mad?" Daniel asked softly. Charles crouched beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "No, buddy," he said, his voice tight but gentle. "Mama's just lost. But we're not." Daniel nodded slowly, then brightened as Alvin called out that they had fireworks ready for the evening. The boy's face lit up once again, as if the clouds had passed and the sun had reclaimed the sky. As they walked back toward the party together, Charles felt something inside him harden, not into bitterness, but into a quiet, steeled determination. He would not let her shadow dim this day. No matter what storms awaited him beyond this island, today belonged to Daniel. And to himself, too. For once in his life, Charles felt free. Night fell over the island like a velvet curtain, deep blue and studded with 1,000 glittering stars. The air still carried the sweetness of the afternoon's laughter, though beneath it all, Charles felt the quiet hum of exhaustion in his bones. Yet as he stood beside Daniel, both of them looking up at the darkening sky, he knew there was one last gift left to give. "Are you ready, buddy?" Charles asked, kneeling beside his son. Daniel's face glowed in the soft light of the lanterns that lined the beach. His eyes were wide with excitement as he nodded eagerly. "Yes, I've never seen fireworks this close." Charles smiled, though his chest tightened. He had promised Daniel a perfect day, and as the firework technician gave the signal, Charles realized it was more than just about his son. He needed this too. He needed to feel like he could still make something beautiful in the middle of the wreckage his life had become. With a loud crackle, the first firework burst into the sky, showering golden, sparks that rained down like blessings from the heavens. Daniel gasped, clapping his hands as more explosions painted the night in brilliant reds, blues, and greens. The children cheered, and even some of the parents who had seemed hesitant at first were now caught up in the moment, their faces lit with wonder. Olivia stood a few steps away, her face tilted up to the sky, her expression soft with quiet satisfaction. Alvin joined her, leaning over to whisper something that made her laugh. Charles caught that moment, the way her eyes flicked toward him, almost like she could feel his gaze. And for a heartbeat, the weight in his chest lessened. But just as quickly, reality crept back in. He felt his phone buzz once more. Out of habit, he checked it. Another message from Shirley, sharp as knives. "Enjoy your fantasy while it lasts. When you come back, we'll talk about your little performance." His jaw tightened. He locked the screen without replying, shoving the phone deep into his pocket. No, not now. She would not have the final word. Tonight. He turned back toward Daniel, scooping him up onto his shoulders as the fireworks finale began. The sky bloomed with light, a final, glorious explosion of color that seemed to defy the darkness itself. "Daddy, this is the best day ever," Daniel shouted over the noise, his voice filled with pure, unfiltered joy. Charles felt something sting behind his eyes. He swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "It's all for you, son. Just for you." When the show ended, the children erupted in applause, jumping and laughing in the sand. Olivia and Alvin quickly directed the staff to bring out lanterns for the final event, a lantern release across the beach. Each child would light their lantern and send it into the sky, carrying their birthday wishes with it. As they passed, a lantern to Daniel, he hesitated. "Can I make 2 wishes, Daddy?" Charles knelt beside him, steadying the small flame in his son's hands. "Of course you can, champ." Daniel's face grew thoughtful, his brows furrowing as he whispered his wishes into the night. Then with a soft push, he released the lantern. Together, they watched it drift upward, swaying gently before it caught the breeze and floated higher and higher into the endless sky. Charles felt Olivia step closer, her voice quiet but steady. "He's going to remember this forever," she said. "I hope so," Charles replied, his gaze never leaving the lantern. "Because I needed him to know that no matter what happens between his mother and me, he will always have this day, this one pure, perfect day." They stood together in the quiet aftermath, the crackling fire nearby casting long shadows across the sand. Most of the guests had begun to wind down, children growing drowsy from excitement and sugar, parents exchanging grateful farewells. Alvin stayed behind, helping the staff clean up, while Olivia worked on arranging transportation back to the mainland for the early departures. Charles lingered a little longer, reluctant to let the moment slip away. He watched Daniel, now curled up in a hammock, his eyelids drooping as sleep began to claim him. And just as he thought the night was finally closing on a beautiful note, Alvin approached with a somber expression. He lowered his voice, glancing toward Daniel to make sure he was out of earshot. "Charles," he said carefully, "I just got a call. Shirley's lawyers. They're moving fast. She's preparing divorce papers." For a moment, the words didn't land. Charles stood still, the crackling of the fire filling the heavy silence between them. He had expected it. He had felt it coming like thunder rumbling beyond the horizon, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a punch to the chest. Charles exhaled slowly, steadying himself as he watched the last of the lanterns fade into the dark. "Let her," he said quietly, finally accepting what had been inevitable for far too long. Let her do whatever she thinks she has to do, because for once, he had no regrets. The return to the mainland felt colder than Charles had expected, like stepping from sunlight into a shadow that had been waiting with open arms. The moment the boat docked, it wasn't the salty breeze or the familiar city skyline that greeted them. It was silence. Heavy, tight, unnatural silence, as if the whole world had taken a deep breath and was waiting for something to break. Alvin helped Daniel off the boat first, keeping things light, pointing out the seagulls overhead and making silly jokes about pirates stealing their luggage. But Charles wasn't fooled. He could feel the tension rolling off his friend in waves. He could feel it in the way Olivia's steps slowed beside him, her eyes scanning the crowd at the pier. Reporters. They were scattered, lurking like vultures just beyond the secured area, cameras at the ready, microphones tucked under their arms, like weapons waiting to be drawn. Charles exhaled sharply, shielding Daniel with his arm as they stepped forward. He had been bracing for this moment, but it still felt like a punch in the gut. These weren't just gossip columnists sniffing for scandal, they were there for blood. The first shout came as soon as he cleared the dock. "Charles, is it true? You embezzled company funds for a personal vacation? Did you really abandon your wife and responsibilities for a beach party? What does Shirley have to say about your reckless spending?" Each question hit like a slap, brutal in its insinuation, dripping with false pity and quiet accusation. Daniel flinched at the noise, pressing closer to Charles's side. His small hand tightened around his father's fingers, and that was all Charles needed to hold his ground. He didn't respond, didn't offer the vultures even a crumb. He kept walking, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But Olivia didn't look away in joy. "Your fantasy while it lasts. When you come back, we'll talk about your little performance." His jaw tightened. He locked the screen without replying, shoving the phone deep into his pocket. No, not now. She would not have the final word tonight. He turned back toward Daniel, scooping him up onto his shoulders as the fireworks finale began. The sky bloomed with light, a final glorious explosion of color that seemed to defy the darkness itself. "Daddy, this is the best day ever!" Daniel shouted over the noise, his voice filled with pure, unfiltered joy. Charles felt something sting behind his eyes. He swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "It's all for you, son. Just for you." When the show ended, the children erupted in applause, jumping and laughing in the sand. Olivia and Alvin quickly directed the staff to bring out lanterns for the final event, a lantern release across the beach. Each child would light their lantern and send it into the sky, carrying their birthday wishes with it. As they passed, a lantern to Daniel, he hesitated. "Can I make 2 wishes, Daddy?" Charles knelt beside him, steadying the small flame in his son's hands. "Of course you can, champ." Daniel's face grew thoughtful, his brows furrowing as he whispered his wishes into the night. Then, with a soft push, he released the lantern. Together, they watched it drift upward, swaying gently before it caught the breeze and floated higher and higher into the endless sky. Charles felt Olivia step closer, her voice quiet but steady. "He's going to remember this forever," she said. "I hope so," Charles replied, his gaze never leaving the lantern. "Because I needed him to know that no matter what happens between his mother and me, he will always have this day. This one pure, perfect day." They stood together in the quiet aftermath, the crackling fire nearby casting long shadows across the sand. Most of the guests had begun to wind down, children growing drowsy from excitement and sugar, parents exchanging grateful farewells. Alvin stayed behind, helping the staff clean up, while Olivia worked on arranging transportation back to the mainland for the early departures. Charles lingered a little longer, reluctant to let the moment slip away. He watched Daniel, now curled up in a hammock, his eyelids drooping as sleep began to claim him. And just as he thought the night was finally closing on a beautiful note, Alvin approached with a somber expression. He lowered his voice, glancing toward Daniel to make sure he was out of earshot. "Charles," he said carefully, "I just got a call. Shirley's lawyers. They're moving fast. She's preparing divorce papers." For a moment, the words didn't land. Charles stood still, the crackling of the fire filling the heavy silence between them. He had expected it. He had felt it coming like thunder rumbling beyond the horizon, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a punch to the chest. Charles exhaled slowly, steadying himself as he watched the last of the lanterns fade into the dark. "Let her," he said quietly, finally accepting what had been inevitable for far too long. Let her do whatever she thinks she has to do, because for once, he had no regrets. The return to the mainland felt colder than Charles had expected, like stepping from sunlight into a shadow that had been waiting with open arms. The moment the boat docked, it wasn't the salty breeze or the familiar city skyline that greeted them. It was silence. Heavy, tight, unnatural silence, as if the whole world had taken a deep breath and was waiting for something to break. Alvin helped Daniel off the boat first, keeping things light, pointing out the seagulls overhead and making silly jokes about pirates stealing their luggage. But Charles wasn't fooled. He could feel the tension rolling off his friend in waves. He could feel it in the way Olivia's steps slowed beside him, her eyes scanning the crowd at the pier. Reporters. They were scattered, lurking like vultures just beyond the secured area, cameras at the ready, microphones tucked under their arms like weapons waiting to be drawn. Charles exhaled sharply, shielding Daniel with his arm as they stepped forward. He had been bracing for this moment, but it still felt like a punch in the gut. These weren't just gossip columnists sniffing for scandal. They were there for blood. The first shout came as soon as he cleared the dock. "Charles, is it true you embezzled company funds for a personal vacation? Did you really abandon your wife and responsibilities for a beach party?" She met the cameras head-on, her chin raised, her expression firm. "Back off!" she snapped at one of the reporters who got too close. "There's a child here." Her voice, sharp and commanding, carved a path through the crowd. They didn't retreat, far, but it was enough to give them space to breathe. They reached the waiting car, and Alvin bundled Daniel safely into the back seat while Charles slid in beside him. Olivia took the front, still scanning the crowd as if expecting an ambush at any moment. As the car pulled away from the chaos, Charles finally allowed himself to exhale. He looked down at Daniel, who was staring out the window, his earlier joy now dulled by confusion and fear. "Why are they so angry, Daddy?" Daniel asked quietly. Charles swallowed hard, wishing he had a simple answer. Wishing he could protect his son from more than just cold looks and sharp words. But this wasn't the island anymore. This was the real world, the world Shirley had poisoned with her narrative. "Because they don't know the truth, buddy," he said softly, brushing Daniel's curls back from his forehead. "But we do, and that's what matters." The drive home was a long, silent stretch of tension. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Charles's chest tightened at the sight of the house. There were no balloons here, no laughter, no sunshine. Only cold walls and colder memories. Alvin stayed behind to handle the press that had followed them, while Charles carried Daniel inside, holding him close as if the boy might disappear if he let go. Inside the house, Shirley was waiting. She stood in the foyer, dressed sharply as always, her arms crossed and her expression carved from ice. The moment Charles stepped through the door, she fixed him with a glare so sharp it could have cut glass. "You've embarrassed me, Charles," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You've embarrassed this family." Daniel, sensing the storm, slipped from his father's arms and hurried up the stairs without a word. Charles watched him go, his heart twisting. He turned back to Shirley, his eyes dark with quiet fury. "No," he said, keeping his tone steady. "What embarrasses this family is not love or joy or giving our son the happiness he deserves. What embarrasses this family is you, Shirley. You, feeding lies to the press. You, turning your back on your own child's birthday. You, trying to Turn this house into a prison. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. You think you're a hero because you threw him a party? I don't care about being a hero, Charles snapped, his patience shredding at last. I care about being his father. There was a beat of silence, thick and suffocating, and then, with a flick of her perfectly manicured fingers, Shirley turned away. You'll be hearing from my lawyers, she said coldly as she walked toward the study. I already have, Charles replied. Her steps faltered, just for a second, but she didn't look back. As her footsteps disappeared down the hallway, Olivia stepped inside, having followed close behind. Her eyes met Charles's, steady and fierce. You stood your ground, she said quietly. For him, Charles answered. The house felt like a battleground now, but for the first time in a long while, Charles realized he wasn't afraid of the fight. The morning after felt like standing in the aftermath of a hurricane. The house was too quiet, except for the distant ticking of the grand clock in the hallway. The same clock Shirley had insisted they import from Paris, claiming it would give the house character. To Charles, it had always felt like a reminder of time running out. Now, it sounded like time had already left them behind. Daniel was still asleep upstairs, curled beneath his blanket like the island adventure had been a dream, and this was the rude awakening. Charles couldn't bear to wake him yet. Let him sleep a little longer, safe from the noise of adult failures. Downstairs, the morning newspapers had arrived, and as Charles expected, the headlines were brutal. Tycoon father squanders millions on private island bash. Wife left behind as husband embarrasses family name. From boardroom to beach. Charles. Ruins reputation in one wild weekend. Charles tossed the papers aside, their poison already expected. The truth sat heavier in his chest than their twisted words ever could. Olivia arrived early, a folder of documents tucked under her arm. She set them on the kitchen counter, her expression as serious as he had ever seen. Damage control, she said, flipping the folder open. We can fight this, Charles. We will. But you need to understand. Shirley's not stopping. She's filed an emergency motion. She wants full custody of Daniel. His breath caught in his chest like a snare tightening around his ribs. Full custody. Of course. Shirley didn't just want to ruin him publicly. She wanted to take the only thing that still mattered. Charles's eyes darkened as he looked at the papers, his jaw tightening. Over my dead body. Olivia's gaze softened, her voice lowering. She's framing you as unstable, impulsive. That trip to the island? She's calling it an unfit father's reckless abandonment of responsibility. She's lining up witnesses, Charles. Your own board members, anyone she can pay or manipulate. It felt like acid burning through his veins, but it also lit a fire he hadn't felt in years. A fire of pure, sharpened defiance. He straightened his shoulders, drawing a slow breath. Then we give her a fight she'll never forget. They worked through the day, Alvin joining them after fending off the press at the gate. Together, the three of them built their counterattack. Evidence of Shirley's cold neglect, recordings of conversations, testimony from staff who had seen how distant she had grown from Daniel. Everything that had once been private between them, Charles now forced into the light not out of spite, but for his son. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was survival. Late that afternoon, Daniel padded sleepily into the kitchen, still rubbing his eyes. Charles immediately scooped him up, holding him close as if to shield him from the chaos clawing at their door. Daddy, Daniel murmured, his voice groggy. Are we going back to the island? Charles's throat tightened. He kissed his son's head, inhaling the soft, familiar scent of him. Not today, buddy, he said softly. But soon. I promise you. Soon. Daniel's small arms wrapped around his father's neck in trust, a silent understanding that whatever storm raged around them, Charles would not let go. As night fell, Charles stood at the window of the study, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn. Olivia joined him there, her arms crossed but her posture steady. You know she's expecting you to fold, Olivia said, her tone edged with quiet fire. She thinks you'll give up, for the sake of peace." Charles shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could see beyond it. All the way, back to that island where his son's laughter had filled the sky. "I've lived too long in her silence," he said. "In her cold world, where love is a transaction and joy is an inconvenience." He turned to Olivia then, truly seeing her for the first time not as a planner, not as an ally, but as someone who had fought alongside him in the darkest hours. "I won't let her win," he said, his voice low and resolute. "Not this time." A quiet moment passed between them, heavy with understanding. Olivia reached out, resting a hand briefly on his arm, grounding him. "For Daniel," she said. "For Daniel," Charles echoed. The house might have been a battlefield, the headlines might scream his downfall, but deep inside, Charles knew he had already won something far greater than Shirley's approval or society's shallow applause. He had chosen his son over appearances, love over pride, truth over pretense. And no matter what Shirley threw at him next, that choice would carry him through. The clock in the hallway chimed midnight, loud and clear. Charles listened to it, a slow, steady beat like a war drum in the distance. He would fight. He would not fold. And as long as he had breath in his chest and his son's hand in his own, he would never, not ever, let Shirley's darkness swallow their light.